All right. Good morning, everyone. Again, setting the Wargaming Scene Center, and it may seem a little ex-post now that we've already had a couple speakers. We've had some discussions right now from some of the general officers, but get you oriented again to the problem. So purpose of the Wargaming setup and scene setters for these days are setting that handrail for you to have a visualization and some tangible appreciation of the problem that you're going to be addressing through the day. Not that you don't. Because the other part of any wargaming scenario, and when you see, particularly the model that we're presenting with Kevin, one of the things that you're instantly going to be driven to is this model is deeply unsatisfying. No kidding. And so we say that to say that we're going to do some physical representations of some things that are happening inside this space. You're going to see placement of units. You're going to see activities. You're going to see what is probably the most representative challenge, which is transportation, but that doesn't tell you everything that's on the transportation. So we're not giving you a good sense of consumption. We're not giving you a good sense of timing, and we're certainly not mapping very well the sustainment, maintenance, and distribution activities that are entirely below the surface here. One of the things that we want to communicate too, in terms of like an audience feedback note, as everybody was talking about the scenario yesterday, is you're going to experience in some of the questions we got from the audience and some of the sidebar that we had a little bit later, is you're going to identify a feature or an attribute to this problem that is yours uniquely to identify and then helpfully synergize and collectively bring back to everybody else. Like, what do I mean? Well, when we're going to look at some of these, the access basing and overflight problem set that we have here in each of the individual nations that are a part of this problem, we know that part of resolution to this is potentially policy, it's contracting, it's legislation. There's a range of things that make this work that are not M and dime. They're either not small M, they're not big M, they're DI and E, and there's someone else's problem, to address, where we're trying to be more effective communicators to other people who enable, solutions for this as well. So again, you're going to see some physical representations of things that are happening in this space. I'm going to be more deliberate in the setup today for this and going to highlight the issues that this particular model and simulation represents. And also because we're not having dynamic engagement, red versus blue, but you're going to see red featured here, some of the things that they would do reasonably, some of the things that blue is doing responsibly and reasonably in this space, how we're interacting with green. All this is designed to do is to set up your frame of mind and your framework. And if things you haven't thought about before become highlighted, great, discovery. If things you've been thinking about are highlighted but have never been resolved, even better. Like there's interest and impetus to doing that. And these are things that we'll communicate to in the report that we'll present for this particular symposium. So if you want to come back and say, hey, Trav, I saw what you were saying and we saw what was inside the model, really, I think it's worthwhile communicating one of the implications of this model inside of this scenario. Perfect, because the report that we send out here is designed to be a communication vehicle for people to talk about under a common appreciation and understanding of a problem to engage some of these serious issues that are we're going to be addressing going forward with this audience. So yes, you should be dissatisfied. Great. You should make discoveries. Awesome. We'll set this up to kind of help you interpret the model and then give us the feedback, and we promise that those bullets will find their way in the final report. Like that is part of what we do, which is super cool. All right, today again, the team is reassembled. So, Kurt Hudson to my left, Kevin Williamson to my right, setting up the scenario behind you. Again, our order of process here is I'll do the scenario and scene setting with a couple caveats along with it. Kevin will put the demonstration out there, and Kurt will be responsible for the synthesis. We are supposed to be done at 10 after the hour because, of course, accordion effect in all conferences. So we are happy to take questions for as long as we can, and until we can't, then we'll take them outside and we'll be at the Wargaming table all day. So you guys rock. Let's do this. Okay, so the purpose of today's scenario is for the Marine Corps and naval logisticians, and this vignette involves the challenge of last-minute actions to surge needed capability for setting a theater logistically just prior to the commencement of armed conflict in a period of compressed, unambiguous indications and warning. We're going to call compressed about 14 days. So that conforms to some of the planning challenges we've seen before. You've probably had about a year to start setting the theater. We talked about the fact that with the interests of allies and partners, not operating under a common coalition, not operating under an alliance, each one of those individual arrangements with the countries that we're in, who, by the way, may not even have an interest in the master problem we set up, which is a forced unification problem with Taiwan. They have their own challenges with that problem set that we're accommodating and reinforcing and supporting, let alone some of our own interests that we care about, and we'll paint that picture in there. So a lot of this is going to be a situation where we already knew we were insufficiently set up for sustainment for an armed conflict scenario, and now we got to push a lot of stuff real quick into a lot of places and fit it in tightly. And more problematically, we're going to have units in movement at that point in time going to their deployment positions to set that last little bit of deterrence. So we have a complication of moving units out with things they need and trying to bring as much as we can in at the same time. Supply in motion. So to General Armis's point a little bit earlier, if you read the history of logistics in World War II, particularly maritime, and the Naval History Department's got a great report that they published last year on that one. You're going to see that one of the biggest challenges is supply in motion. Like, how do we keep it flowing and moving? Okay. This is accompanied, this particular situation, by supporting actions from the PRC, information, air, and maritime forces to close access to needed air lines of communications and sea lines of communication. So we're going to represent how they're maneuvering in that space to do that. And it's not only affecting us, but it's also affecting allies and partners. It's a recognition that sufficient global positioning of supplies and leveraging of regional sustainment frameworks will likely not be set into the last moments prior to armed conflict to support sustainment, maintenance, distribution operations for the Marine Corps across the operational continuum. The overall goal is to show that as nations elect to work more closely with the U.S. and with AUKUS, we're going to use that as our dominant partnership in this environment. They're likely to, as they work more closely with us and with AUKUS to counter likely PRC progression towards initiating armed conflict. Access basing and overflight for U.S. and allied nations may only increase at the last moment. This will cause insufficient time to surge materiel into the theater. Primarily, we're going to focus in this model on Class 3, Class 5, Class 7, Class 8, and Class 9. So hitting all of our fuel, ammo, principal end items, vehicles, and other items we have to get in there that are offensive capable that may have been denied previously. 8, medical supplies, how we're going to deal with that, and medical evacuation. And then Class 9, supply parts and spares that we need to keep the organization in action. To meet this demand for follow-on sustainment, maintenance, and casualty evacuation and distribution to overcome logistic culmination in the opening phases of armed conflict. We are literally trying to keep ourselves from running out of stuff long enough to make a difference. The essence of this challenge is on mitigating the delta between the initial limitations of setting the theater based on host nation restraints or limited infrastructure with sufficient supply, maintenance, and transportation means to support the naval force. The leveraging of last-minute access to regional locations for prepositioning operations and industrial-based support will likely increase the risk to sustain armed conflict actions. Okay, I'm going to skip down, and there was a couple great questions. Master Sergeant from CLB-8 who mentioned some things in terms of survivability and maneuver for logistics. This is going to hit on something that people like Colonel Angel, Colonel McCander, and I dealt with in Afghanistan. So big open spaces that are not being supported by armed lethal forces, leaving effectively all of the distribution routes and transportation lanes subject to logisticians conducting their own maneuver and having to set their own security inside that process. So let's talk a little bit about this one. Apologize as I reach for my notes here. So first of all, a lot of logistics maneuvers going to be conducted independently and in ungoverned spaces or with negotiated access. In this particular problem set, we set this as an economy of force mission in this particular AO. So what we created as a challenge from quantity, you're going to see is the same problem in other parts of this AO from just distance. So we don't have a lot of stuff. When you're trying to master distance, you're not going to have sufficient amounts either, just simply because of the legs of movement that you're dealing with. And then this really kind of gets into protection. So when you think, we're going to represent a couple capabilities here that are alternative transportation means that may very well have some better survivability postures because they're low observable, they're moving a little bit faster, they have a lower sustainment footprint to keep them moving, as opposed to 53K, C-130, V-22, high altitude, exposed, take your pick of things. So how's that moving within the intra-theater and tactical connectors, let alone large shipping movement that's doing the intra-theater side of the house. So keep that as a feature in mind for logistics protection. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. Logisticians are going to have to adopt those postures that are survivable that were typically allocated to maneuver units. You're going to have to do the exact same thing. And when we think and reflect back on our recent history, if you do an Afghanistan or Iraq problem, all of the places that maneuver guys could actually occupy and influence, and they effectively left the rest of their battle spaces as security areas. Well, that was the places that we logisticians were transiting through, where we had to do our own maneuver and protection. And Colonel Angel will probably remember that at the time in 2011 with Afghanistan, when the commandant was RCT-8, Second MLG went over and said, hey, look, we're in a situation where we're exposed. We need to add some EOD capability and we need to add some JTACs. And we're not doing offensive or defensive maneuver inside of your AO. That's your job. But we are taking an active or passive posture. And so we had some lethal engagements it generated from the MLG, from those convoys that were hitting some of the insurgent movement that was going through places that obviously crossed between transiting fighters all the way through transiting drugs. And it made a difference. And incidentally decreased a lot of incidences that were happening in Nowzad and Musa Kela in the northern part of Helmand. So logisticians will contribute to some portion of the lethality simply just to keep the sustainment moving. So think about it from that particular posture and where that scales up inside this theater. All right, the second thing I really want to talk about too is the nature of these legs being so long and so distant. Then the question is, what posture are we taking, push or pull logistics? And the answer is yes. But the dependency in what we're seeing in this particular scenario is really around the data and the networks to do that. So it's the trade space between efficiency and effectiveness. Effectiveness being the spot that we're trying to derive resilience, but you cannot be absolutely inefficient either. You're trying to eke the efficiencies out of that, and that's where your data and networks come in to inform how you're moving and sustaining inside of this AO to keep this force operating and in the posture that it needs to be either an effective deterrent and a credible one, or a credible engagement capability to prevent the adversary from reaching their goals. And we're doing it in support of allies and partners. There may very well be a joint force ground land component commander. It won't be us. It'll be each individual Indonesian, Malaysian, Singaporean commander that we're talking about here in this particular scenario. Okay, ramping down. I'm going to talk a little bit about allies and partners and what they're doing, because it'll be consequent to what Kevin's going to present. So, and I think we've kind of exhausted some of the key conditions that we're talking about, trying to surge things in, trying to keep them from culminating, and then how to manage that continuous sustainment and movement intra-theater and inter-theater. A good scenario should reflect as much as possible actual conditions and then give you plausible recommendations on how to engage this problem if it begins to emerge. So what we're doing is we're representing some of the things that we know exist currently that are cooperative capabilities in this AO, and then a problem for you as logisticians on how you're going to be able to position yourselves to support the force. A lot of the force that we're going to depict here can have something of an offshore or low visibility posture with respect to the host nation. Logisticians, though, are going to kind of appear in those points and nodes where we are highly visible to others. What does that necessarily do in terms of how the host nation will treat or respond to our presence and willingness to support, even if they're being threatened to by the same problem? So just think about it from this perspective. So Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia have a cooperative defense agreement for the Straits of Malacca. The question that we're going to have here is, did we do enough in day-to-day campaigning that we built ourselves an arrangement that we can move somewhat seamlessly from this competition and integrate effectively with their cooperation activities and also support ours? The scenario that we're putting out here right now is we're trying to keep that Strait of Malacca open because the capabilities that are being drawn from Diego Garcia in this scenario, both overflight, potentially bomber support, as well as maritime pre-positioning squadrons, intend to move through these highly contested areas. So the responsibility of CJTF SPR, South Pacific region, in this scenario is really that defense of the straits and our own right to self-defense to make sure our assets are able to move to support the other CJTF in this theater. That's why we're postured here. The Indonesians, interestingly enough, actually have an outpost now in Natuna Island, and so we'll point that out, but it's effectively within their EEZ and the approaches into the Philippines. But it's a perfect position to set up sea control, sea denial positions, and a cooperative EAB. So we put that position in here this time as well, where we're directly supporting their capacity to prevent PRC movement inside the scenario. Papua New Guinea, of course, has serviced one of our nodes here. So between Singapore, where we have one logistics node, and then Lombrum Naval Base in Manus Island, where we have our other global positioning network node right now for the Marine Corps in this particular scenario. They've effectively authorized 5 more positions under a defensive cooperation agreement where we can put some positioning. And in this particular case, what they're allowing us now to do now is increase our self-defensive posture and force protection to ensure this mission. And so we're now allowed to put in lethal defensive capabilities. But because it is a economy of force mission, we're doing a lot of unmanned ISR capability and armed ISR. So from that perspective, that's effectively how we're going to treat that eastern side of the theater. It's an economy in an economy. It's a key logistics node, but it's largely going to be serviced by unmanned capabilities. And we'll see that reflected a little bit in the presentation here too. Okay, that's a lot to consume in terms of how the world is set and the implications of that world. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to kind of demonstrate how that appears on the map a little bit.
So good morning, everyone. So for those of you who weren't here yesterday, I'm just going to orient you to this area, the geography. So this is actually where the vignette is taking place. Everything outside of there are just for world building purposes or just getting data. And so very similar to yesterday, what we have up here in the north is we have PLA forces. So what you'll see once I hit play is some aircraft surge out, just do some normal patrols, and then we'll have some destroyers and frigates going south to test some of the freedom of navigation maneuvers. What's not represented in here, but what you should visualize is these blue vessels. Just imagine that partners and allies were also there. So the Indonesians, like Travis mentioned, this is that sea control or sea denial area that they'll be surging out of. And these are going to be the EAB positions. So like he mentioned, we have some non-program of record capabilities, like Regent's Viceroy Electric Sustainment Model. And so we've got 4 of them just to showcase once I hit play, they'll be sustaining that EAB position. And then for comparison, I've also got a current USNS Watson, just so you could get an idea of, you know, how many trips do the non-program of record capabilities actually get in. So another EAB position out here to the east. Then, as you mentioned, we have these ISR unmanned aircraft that are going to be coming out here doing their missions. The green forces on the map, just like yesterday, are going to be your allies and partners, so air defense, local security forces. Down here to the south, similar to yesterday, this is where that MEU got dropped off, so what you're actually going to see is just more patrolling around that area, just kind of establishing that pattern of life while the sustainment vessel actually goes to Darwin, and then creates another leg out to Manus Island just to get an idea of what that looks like. So a lot of this is just going to be sustainment. I'll go ahead and press play so you can kind of get an idea of what this looks like. And then we do have stuff from Diego Garcia. So if you wanted to get an idea of how far Diego Garcia is from Darwin, it's just under a 7-day trip. So when Travis is talking about, you know, making sure we have enough stuff and, you know, what kind of stuff is that? How long does it take? Is it going to be there? It's just some examples that we can have. So I will go ahead and speed it up a little bit more. And you could start seeing the Regent vessels coming out to supply the EAB position. They're much faster than the USNS Watson is over here. And then same thing over here for these ISR unmanned assets. So speed it up a little bit more so you can get an idea of just how long it takes for this stuff to actually happen. So down at the bottom is kind of like a time lapse. So if you're familiar with like video editing software, it works the same way. But we're about to hit 12 hours here. They're still making their trips, And this is going to be most of the visualization for today. So it's very similar to setting the theater, except we're in crisis now. So as they come down here, it's just things are getting a little bit more contested, making sure we can still get supplies to the EAB positions, and then watching the sustainment still happen. So we're on day 2 now, and the sustainment ship from the MEU is almost at Darwin. So it takes about 2 days just to get to Darwin from there. And like Travis mentioned, if you have questions afterwards, you know, how long does it take to get from here to there? Or if you have a non-program of record prototype, that maybe you'd like to get some data integrated in here offline, and then maybe get a report, just come talk to us afterwards. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kurt.
Good morning. Good to see everybody back today. Also, welcome to the new faces in the crowd. I want to talk about a few things to think about like we did yesterday. We know we've moved from competition to crisis. We've got about 14 days before anticipated operations in conflict may begin. And so the essence of the challenge today is, how do we mitigate the delta in where we got in setting the theater? If you work under the old adage, improve your position every day, setting the theater may be a continuous task. You may also have the crisis start before you've met all your conditions for your desired end state. So when you think through that, time is already short, and as you're trying to figure out how to offset those shortfalls from competition, you focus on those main class supply Travis laid out. What are some of the things to think about? Always remember your constraints, your limitations, things you must do, things you can't do, and also look at rechecking your facts and assumptions as you transition from one phase to the next. We think we've learned over time that some of our biggest operational vulnerabilities in risk to mission are during transitions, because conditions begin to change very rapidly, and the conditions that you try to mitigate may be conditions you didn't anticipate, right? Things are happening you did not anticipate. So you have a lot more friction. Simultaneously, your footprint in all domains and all types of resources, to include humans, is growing very fast in this crisis surge. So you've been doing day-to-day sustainment. You've been working on those partnerships with allies and partners. You've been trying to set conditions for a rapid transition to crisis or conflict, and it's happened. So two things I would offer that you should think about, highlighting that first one, the conditions are going to change rapidly, is inside of your plan, inside of the conditions that inform your desired end state, what needs to change and what doesn't need to change. You see that most commonly in staff estimates, because as the first general this morning was talking about, you set the four aside and you focus on the maneuver warfighting function intensely, and you assume the logistician is going to give you the things you need to do your thing with. What you find is, if each staff section is not updating their estimates, especially their facts and assumptions that inform their conditions to your decisions, you can have that aha moment. And I won't name any locations or names, but a commander had an aha moment in a large-scale combat experiment where they were transitioning from a phase where they thought they were setting conditions for his decisive operation. And at the end of the day, in the AAR, the question was asked, so Commander, it didn't go as well as you thought it did. What are some of the things you think caused the unfavorable outcome? And he talked through, well, Red overmatches us. They have unlimited magazine depth. They have shorter distances, and they've got most of the favorable conditions for combat operations. Okay, that's probably all true, but where do you think, inside of your conditions that informed your end state, your plan may have contributed to the unfavorable outcome? He said, I'm not sure. I think we got it all covered. And so then the four bravely spoke up and said, sir, you changed priorities of lethal fires, and you changed your decision points related to that, but we didn't allow time for repositioning of all the sustainment that was required to support that change in priority of fires. And it was because you had another economy of force effort being placed at the time. So the sequence of the operation was synchronized over space but not time. And then the commander, you saw the light bulb in the room, and he goes, you know what? I just unsupplied myself going into my decisive operation. I just unsupplied myself going into my decisive operation. And it was based on the way his staff worked and how they did deliberately or did not deliberately update facts and assumptions and recheck conditions in a transition from defensive operations to offensive operations for his decisive op. You can say unsupplied maybe is not a verb. That's okay. Everything's a verb today. Especially when you're educated in South Boston like I am. But think about that. And that's when you look at why transitions are so hard and make us more vulnerable. The conditions are rapidly changing, and you don't control as many conditions as you did in competition potentially. The other part of that is when you look at the core components of rapidly expanding your theater from MCDP 4, it says the key components are pre-deployment preparation. Well, we know that happens in competition. Travis did a good laydown of that earlier this morning. And are you looking with an eye to the future in competition with your allies and partners? We know a lot of these locations are very austere without a lot of infrastructure or maybe limited infrastructure that may not be very robust. A simple example is paved roads in just about any theater service members could deploy to. When I start doing high density, high volume convoys in every direction on a limited highway infrastructure that wasn't designed or ever thought they would be supporting heavy equipment transports, medium and light trucks for regiments, divisions potentially, right? The road network could literally collapse on you during transition to crisis. Critical bridges could literally collapse. Think about the historical example would be Highway 1 and Desert Shield from Damam, 500 miles to Tapline Pipeline Road, where both Joint Forces Command East and 7th Corps were beginning to set up during the buildup. 500 miles, one highway, 2 lanes, most cases open desert, in some places raised with no shoulders up to 6 feet in the air. Do you think when they moved the 1st Cavalry Division with over 300 tanks on heavy equipment transports that there was whole sections of that road that had just fallen into the desert, right? So when you think about those things, conditions, update facts and assumptions. If my primary route is the only route because it's the only paved route, what happens on a rainy day, for example? And you can use your scouts to do route reconnaissance during competition, during an exercise, to generate that hard data on the quality of the infrastructure, right? Route reconnaissance is a common core task for cavalry scouts in the Army, and I'm sure for our reconnaissance Marines as well. When you think through that, then deployment execution is like blowing up a balloon. Consider the theater as a balloon, way faster than that little hydrogen thing does at the drugstore, right, when you buy your kids balloons. So not only are you sustaining day to day and trying to reposture the stand-in force, you are simultaneously trying to receive, stage, on, remove, and integrate the follow-on force. The simultaneity of sustaining a known requirement, transporting and distributing that as well, reposition, and receiving, right? Who's receiving the follow-on forces? When do we run out of things to include Marines to do the thing, right? Supply chain management. We talk about visibility from camp to front. We have lots of bumper stickers and buzzwords for that. But I would only offer what can go wrong and how do you mitigate it and where does your responsibility begin and end in that chain? Because you want to know, and I think about personnel, you want to know when Timmy leaves camp home and he's positioned at the front so that when you give your voice and the sound of your voice gives the command, Timmy's in the right place to do that. And so supply chain visibility, I think, isn't just being able to track a thing with an RFID tag. It's when does control change along the chain? So if something happens, you can react. It's very, to me, that's the harder part. And everybody else is like, no, you gotta have visibility. Okay, a container falls off a ship, that container's the nods for Alpha Company. You know it's not on the ship, what next? Visibility, I would offer, is just part of that condition setting. We've talked infrastructure. The other piece is, how do you reorganize to enable continuous coordination with allies and partners? Here's why. This may be the first time stress is put on the relationship, and their national interests may start to diverge from ours. Their behaviors towards you, the access you had may change unexpectedly. How are you accounting for that? So I want to sum it up because we're getting near our time. Some of the challenge I just talked about were unpredictable and rapidly changing conditions, infrastructure damage just caused by our operations. The enemy's not fired a shot yet, and we're talking about infrastructure damage that impacts force flow. Could impact repositioning the stand-in force. Communication breakdown, we talked about visibility, we talked about host nation coordination. Here's the other one I'll touch on very briefly. Resource scarcity. As the priorities of the host nation, our allies and partners changes, things that you contracted in competition may get scarcer in crisis because now they're mobilizing their military forces as well in their national interests. How do you anticipate that? How do you put in a plan to mitigate a change in your contracting based on resource scarcity? The balloon is blowing up rapidly, and their army and their military may be growing too. They may mobilize. So I may be blowing up a balloon within a balloon, and I don't control the one inside my balloon, right? It's things you think about. Security threats, I've covered that. Think about the asymmetric threats as a part of that. A stevedore strike, for example, in the United States. Historical example, 1st Cavalry Division, Desert Storm, stevedore strike. What do? Ship sails 3 weeks late. Does the division sit in the port, or does what's in theater go forward to protect Saudi Arabia? Who knew? And then the last one, and I'll close really quickly, but you never want to forget the human element of warfare, right? If man is the ultimate war machine, as General Patton once stated, and I know I shortened the quote, I'm running out of time. What's the change in the conditions on the stress on our Marines and our other supporting forces? Competition is stressful. You're already in an austere environment. Things are scarce. You're working hard every day because that's what Americans do. We just work all the time. And now you're bringing in new Marines and new organizations, and you're doing everything in the middle of impending conflict, for which for a lot of our force may be their first time, or they may see the elephant. How are you adapting your decisions to the stress on your force to make sure that they are sharpest when you plunge the spear into the heart of the enemy? I'll close there because I gave you lots of things to think about. We didn't talk about the solutions, but you know what they are. They're the training of our Marines, they're our technology and innovation, and there are how we prepare in competition to win decisively if deterrence does not work.
Thanking Kurt again, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to take questions or comments. I think that Brandon needs to, kind of restore momentum. But with that in mind, happy to take discussions all day long. Hopefully, this sets some conditions and frameworks for you to think about problems through the day. Unsatisfying model, hopefully satisfying solutions in the long run. You guys are awesome. We'll talk to you later.